Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our Feeding the Future, Sustainable Food for People and Planet series. I think we'll have some more people joining as we get going, but in the interest of time, I thought we would get started. I am Ryan Flaherty, Director of Business Partnerships at Sustainable Conservation. And for those of you who don't know us, Sustainable Conservation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping California thrive by uniting people to solve the toughest challenges facing our air, land, and water. Every day we bring together business, farmers, scientists, government, nonprofits, and others to steward the resources that we all depend on in ways that are just and make economic sense. And we decided to put on this Feeding the Future webinar series because as we navigate the pandemic and the impacts that it's had, it's really a good time for all of us to rethink and redouble our focus on climate change and what we can collectively do to address it. This webinar series focuses on our global food system because we need to figure out how to feed a population that is expected to reach 10 billion people by 2050 and doing so without destroying the planet. And addressing that food system is critical to successfully addressing climate change and other environmental issues. And California has a big role to play in that. So if you did not have a chance to see the previous webinars in this series, you can find the recordings on our website at suscon.org. Those webinars covered topics like the critical role of our food system, water as it relates to agriculture, as well as food waste. So if those sound of interest, check them out, suscon.org, and go to the events section to find those recordings. So now turning to today's webinar, I don't think that I could be more excited for the discussion we're about to have. Within the frame of agricultural sustainability, one of the most widely discussed type of production is dairies. And people tend to have very strong opinions one way or the other. And yet, most people know very little about dairies, and even those that work on dairy environmental performance are learning new things all the time. And that includes us. We at Sustainable Conservation have been working on and around dairies for more than 20 years, and we are still learning new things every day that shape our work to find and scale sustainable solutions. So before we get started, a few logistics. We're going to leave about 15 minutes at the end for your questions from the audience, and we will pull those from the Q&A box. Please feel free to add your questions into that Q&A box as they come to you. You don't need to wait until the end, and it's actually helpful if we get those in earlier. And in case you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please let us know via the chat box, and Hannah from our team will help you out. So troubleshoot issues in the chat box, questions in the Q&A box. And lastly, this webinar will be recorded, and then we'll share that link afterwards with the registrants in case you'd like to revisit part of it or if you'd like to share with others. So I'll introduce the panelists in a second, but first, we wanted to get a sense of who else is in the room. So we'd like to do two quick polls. First of all, we'd like to understand who are you? What is your organizational affiliation? So the poll should have popped up on your Zoom screen. Please select the one option that best describes you and your organization. And we've got about 3/4. We'll give it a couple more seconds. The last ones to trickle in. And I just noticed the second question is also in there, so you're all filling that one out as well. That's great. Okay, so we have about a third from nonprofits, and then after that, a decent amount, about another third from um, agriculture, business and dairy, kind of the business sector, both ag related and not, and then about 10% dairies and 10% others. So a good mix, government representatives as well. And then the other question, which is to help us understand kind of where are we starting from in terms of knowledge about California dairies. Looks like about half of you know some things. And then other than that, we've got kind of an even distribution of those that feel like they know a lot or are experts, and those that either know very little or know about dairies, but not in California. So that's great to have such a good mix. We were hoping for that. And I think that definitely mirrors, at least in terms of the types of organizations and perspectives, the panelists that we have here. And I will introduce them in a second, but because there are a decent number of participants who aren't familiar with California dairies, I would like to do a quick overview of the California kind of dairy industry before we move on. So California does have a very large dairy industry. California dairies produce about 20% of all of the milk produced in the United States. Dairy is consistently California's #1 agricultural commodity, above even almonds and grapes, which may come as a surprise to many people on the line. Dairy and supporting industries generate a significant amount of revenue and jobs in California. And to produce that milk, we have about 1.7 million cows on about 1,300 dairies across the state, although that number of dairies is declining. The vast majority of those cows and dairies are located in the San Joaquin Valley. So in kind of the central area of the state between Stockton and south to Bakersfield. Most of the remaining dairies and cows are in the Sacramento Valley, kind of north of Stockton, and then on the North Coast, with the North Coast dairies typically being smaller, more pasture and organic dairies as compared to the San Joaquin Valley. And all of those dairies, no matter what type of region or what type of dairy or region, can generate environmental impacts across greenhouse gases, air, and water. And we're going to dig into some of that a little bit more today. So that's a very quick and dirty, rough overview of the dairy industry. And it certainly does not cover the complexity. There's a lot of generalities there. So it doesn't cover the complexity of the industry or the work being done by the dairies and others. So we're going to jump into that as we move into our panel. And so with that, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists who will help us unpack the complex world of dairying and environmental sustainability. So I will go in alphabetical order of first names. So starting with Aaron Wickstrom, and if panelists, if you could just kind of say hi, so we know who you are. Aaron is a 4th generation dairy farmer and managing partner at Valsigna Farms and Wickstrom Dairies located in Hillmar, which is in the northern part of the San Joaquin Valley. He is a great believer in integrating technology on the farm to benefit their team, their animals, and the environment. And they've been using a variety of conservation practices, including strip till, no-till, as well as precision agriculture, or precision irrigation, excuse me, and advanced manure separation. Next, we have Diana Giacomini Hagan, who is the co-CEO and chief financial officer at Point Reyes Farmstead Cheese Company. After decades of dairying, Diane and her family launched the company about 20 years ago on that dairy in Marin County, which is north of San Francisco. Farmstead cheese is internationally regarded as a premier producer of award-winning handcrafted cheeses. They are delicious, I can vouch for that. And they've also received the Leopold Conservation Award in 2013 to recognize their dedication to protect and restore the natural resources under their care. Next up, we have Dr. Frank Mitloehner. Frank is Dr. Mitloehner, sorry, is a professor and air quality specialist in cooperative extension at the Department of Animal Science at UC California, or University of California, Davis. He received his master's degree in animal science and agricultural engineering from the University of Leipzig, Germany, and his PhD degree in animal science from Texas Technical University. And Dr. Mitloehner is here in the state, but he is a globally renowned expert for agricultural air quality and livestock housing and husbandry. And last but certainly not least, Laurel Firestone. Laurel is a board member at the State Water Resources Control Board. She was appointed by Governor Newsom in February 2019. Prior to joining the State Water Board, Laurel co-founded and co-directed the Community Water Center, which is a statewide nonprofit environmental justice organization based in the Central Valley as well as the Central Coast. And throughout her career, she's focused on ensuring all Californians have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water and building increased diversity, equity, and inclusivity into water decision-making. So with that, let's get into it. And I would just, to everyone that's listening and participating, whether you consider yourself a dairy expert or a newcomer, we invite you to open your hearts and minds to what these incredible panelists have to say. You might just be surprised at what you walk away with. So with that, I think it's most important to start with the dairy producers, and particularly since we have some on the line that aren't that familiar with California dairies. Would appreciate if Aaron and Diana can talk just a little bit about the operations that you manage, the regions, the issues that you're managing day to day. And maybe we can start with, well, Aaron, I saw you come off mute, so we can start with Aaron.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ryan. Thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit about our operations, our farming operations, and covering the topic of sustainability. So like Ryan said, I am a fourth generation dairy farmer. I have the great opportunity to co-own and manage our family dairy. This year, we celebrate 81 years in business. We milk every day 2,400 Jersey cows. I get to work with an absolutely wonderful team of people every day, 27 men and women that make the operation run 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. So along with that, just appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today.
Great, thank you, Aaron. And Diana, how about you?
Hi, yes, thanks Ryan for putting this together. I think it's a worthwhile topic and certainly a very complicated topic to talk about dairies and how they can be economically and environmentally sustainable. A little bit about our history. As Ryan mentioned, our dairy farm is located about an hour north of San Francisco in West Marin County. You can see the property behind me. We're on the shores of Tamales Bay. I'm a third generation, not quite as long as Aaron, dairy farming family. Both my grandfather and then my father got into the business. The farm we're on now, my parents purchased a little over 60 years ago. And for the first 40 years, my father milked Holstein cows and sold the fluid milk to a local processor. But then in the mid 90s, approached my sisters and I. Yes, it is true. There are no brothers in the family. So he kind of had to deal with that. We'd all gone off and earned, after graduating from college, worked in a variety of different business degrees. But then in the mid 90s, he brought us back together and said, hey, I have this idea of creating a value added product with the milk rather than selling all of the milk. And this is how I think we can do it. And certainly at that time, we were looking for ways to diversify and stay viable in conventional dairying, which had become, not that easy to do at the time. So for us, being a vertically integrated company where we were able to both raise the cows, milk the cows, and then have that milk be a major component of a product that we brought to the consumer was really important to us. So we kind of signed on, and in 2000, we launched Point Reyes Farmstead Cheese Company, started making blue cheese. That's what we're most well known for out there across the country, and really spent the time to build our brand and our customer base. Slowly starting out using just a small portion of our milk. We were still selling the majority of the milk to Clover at that time. Until, probably 2012, maybe, where we were got to a point where we're using 100% of our milk in our cheese products. We make 4 core cheese products today. We actually opened a second cheese plant in Petaluma, where we make cheese both on the farm and in Petaluma. And producing nearly 2 million pounds of cheese annually. That's kind of what we're at currently. As far as the dairy and the farm and the herd, today we are milking about 450 Holstein cows. And we've got about 700 cows that we have here on the farm. And like I said, 100% of that milk goes into the cheese production. And just to mention too, in terms of our business segments, because we do have a lot of things going on, I feel like every day it's like a new challenge. We've got the dairy and the herd and the land that we manage. We're a landlord to several of our employees. It's some theme I'm going to talk about in terms of labor and how we're affected by that, as well as our cheese production in the 2 plants that I mentioned. And we have an agritourism business, and when we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how we can be as transparent as possible, educate people, get people to the farm to see what we're doing, see the different sustainable practices, and how that can fit in with doing good for the environment and our land, but while also being a profitable business. So we do tours and tastings and educational events to try to get that across to the public who aren't as aware of the dairy industry and what's going on. That's what I've got for now.
That's great, thank you. So between Aaron and Diana, we have a good mix there of types of dairies: a smaller pasture kind of style dairy that is vertically integrated, that has a processing and cheese production, and then a larger dairy in the valley that grows feed and processes feed to the cows. And we'll go into a little bit more of kind of what the implications are for those different types of production as it relates to environmental sustainability in a second. And moving into environmental sustainability, I want to move over to Frank. The greenhouse gas footprint of dairies is something that has certainly received a lot of attention as it relates to dairies and dairy production. And many people's opinions of dairies and consumption of dairy products have been influenced by that. Yet there's even a debate within the academic community about that greenhouse gas footprint. So I was wondering if you could shed a light on the debate about that dairy's greenhouse gas footprint, as well as your perspective on how California dairies and dairy performance fits within that.
First of all, thank you, Sustainable Conservation, for putting this together. I'm very pleased to be part of this. Yeah, the topic of the impact livestock has on climate is big. We read it every day in the news. And when you look at a state like California, our dairy sector makes up about 5% of total greenhouse gases. Just to give you some comparison, the transportation sector is about 50%, so about 10 times more. It's a sizable chunk, 5% is a sizable chunk. That 5% is largely comprised of methane. So there are different greenhouse gases. One is CO2, one is methane, one is nitrous oxide. But of the 3 greenhouse gases, the most important one is methane. And the dairy sector and the beef sector are 2 of the most important sectors producing that methane gas. Okay, so now the question is, How relevant is methane? So first of all, overall, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's about 28 times more potent than CO2. So there's no question about the potency. And when I say potency, it's the ability of that gas to trap heat from the sun. So methane is that. But methane is also more complicated because methane, in contrast to the other greenhouse gases which are just produced, such as CO2 and nitrous oxide by various sources, methane is not just produced, but also naturally removed from the atmosphere. And that's what most people don't really either understand or account for. Okay, so methane is produced, let's say, by cows when they belch or from their manure. But methane is also atmospherically removed, and that's a process called hydroxyl oxidation. I know that's a mouthful, and I don't want to give you a chemistry 101 here, but it's important to note that methane is different from the other greenhouse gases insofar that it's not just produced, but also naturally removed. And this natural removal is oftentimes not considered when quantify the impact of methane on climate. So people only look at the production, but not at the atmospheric removal of methane. And that's a very important detail to consider. Why? Because if you have a constant herd of cattle, then that means the amount of methane they produce and the amount of methane that's destroyed through hydroxyl oxidation are roughly in balance. A constant herd does not really add new and additional methane to the atmosphere, causing new and additional warming. Increasing herd sizes and increasing emissions of methane would do that. And we see that in parts of the developing world. There, a growing demand for animal source foods leads to people growing herd sizes. But in a place like California, we don't do that. We have pretty stable herds or even decreasing herds. But even more important is this. So a stable herd does not lead to increasing warming, okay? I know it takes a little while to wrap your minds around that, but because of that atmospheric removal of methane, a constant herd leads to constant warming. But if we manage to reduce methane, then something really interesting happens, because in addition to the natural removal, we are now increasing that removal by mitigating, for example, methane. And that has been happening over the last few years. Many of you know that SB 1383 was passed a few years back, mandating a 40% reduction of methane to be achieved by the year 2030. Our farmers at first didn't think they could ever achieve that, a 40% reduction of methane. But little did they know that the state decided to partner with them on incentivizing techniques and technologies on farms to reduce methane. So not just did many farms produce or build anaerobic digesters, so-called covered lagoons, and these covered lagoons, I'll get to that in a minute, reduced methane, but there's also a lot of research on other sources of methane, such as the belching, and how to reduce the belching, which is a major source of methane. We are now at a point, after only a few years after that law has passed, where our dairy industry in the state has reduced its methane footprint by 25%. And that is pretty sensational, I have to say. I never expected that to happen. And that's largely a result of people covering their lagoon. That cover traps the biogas that's generated underneath. And then this biogas is converted into what's called renewable natural gas, and that's a fuel type. And that fuel type is then used to fuel vehicle fleets, such as semi-trucks and so forth. This is considered the most carbon negative fuel type there is. So we have already achieved a 25% reduction of methane. And here comes what's beautiful. When you reduce methane, then you induce a short-term impact on climate, namely what's called negative warming. It sounds negative, but it's actually a good thing because you're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. So by reducing methane, our dairy industry contributes to achieving our climate goals in the state, and that's really important. Now, I only have 10 minutes here, and this is a complex topic, obviously, but in addition to mitigation of greenhouse gases through use of, let's say, anaerobic digesters like these covered lagoons, or feed additives, which, by the way, we have found can reduce enteric emissions by anywhere between 10 to 50%, There's also this other issue of efficiencies in livestock production and how they affect emissions. Just really quickly, in the United States, we used to have 25 million dairy cows about 60 years ago, 25 million. Today we have in the US only 9 million. So we went from 25 to 9, but with this much smaller herd today, we are producing 60% more milk. And that means the carbon footprint of a gallon of milk in the United States has shrunk by 2/3 over the last 60 years, by 2/3. This is not some greenwashing or creative accounting. This is real. A reduction of herd size with a concurrent increase in production has a profound impact on the environmental footprint of livestock. Now, that does not mean everything is honky-dory, okay? The concentration and modernization of the dairy sector also leads to other concerns in the sustainability arena. For example, people are concerned about animal welfare at times, or about ammonia emissions and so on. And we are not leaving that out. We are actually laser sharp in focusing on how to reduce not just methane, but also other greenhouse gases, along with criteria pollutants such as ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, or emissions that go into surface and groundwater. So this is a very complex issue, almost impossible to reduce down to something meaningful in 10 minutes, but I should try it. I hope that you learned something.
I think you did an amazing job, Dr. Mitloehner. And so I would just say kind of key takeaways there are methane is somewhat unique opportunity to kind of draw down potentially as opposed to increasing, as well as two ways to deal with methane. One is kind of capture it and create energy. The other is to avoid the production of methane in the first place. So different options for dairies. And then a key thing being about efficiency, production efficiency, and how that can reduce the global kind of GHG emissions, but also that can potentially create more localized impacts, particularly as it relates to air quality and then water. So on that note, I wanted to pass it over to Laurel and talk about some of the, on the water side, talk a little bit about some of the drinking water issues that we're facing in the state broadly. And then, you know, what does that look like in areas of higher concentrations of dairies and impacts to communities?
Great, thank you. So yeah, as opposed to greenhouse gas issues within water, there are very acute and localized impacts from dairies that are the focus. So at least in California, you know, particularly for vulnerable drinking water sources, and this can be in some cases causing groundwater contamination or exacerbating already existing groundwater contamination. And in particular, the biggest contaminative concern from dairies is nitrate from a drinking water perspective. Nitrate is an acute contaminant that we regulate under the Safe Drinking Water Act. It can cause death in infants, is dangerous to pregnant women, and also has been linked to more chronic health impacts in adults as well over time. We have seen over the past decades that nitrate has been, so our drinking water standards have been in place since 1975. Nitrate has been a leading cause of well closure, of drinking well closure in the state, as water systems have had to drill new wells that are deeper to avoid shallow aquifers that are now contaminated with nitrate. And dairies are not the only source of nitrate in shallow groundwater. Really, it's many, you know, especially in these intensively farmed areas, there's just years of intensive fertilizer use. And, you know, locally, in localized areas, inadequate wastewater disposal systems are also contributors. So we've also seen, and there's been studies documenting that nitrate is also a contaminant that's been found to be more frequent and have higher levels in Latino, Latinx communities and low-income communities in the San Joaquin Valley. So this is also a racial justice issue and a case of disproportionate impacts on some of our most vulnerable and underserved communities in California. So nitrate is just one contaminant that has meant that communities, over 300 communities, don't have access to safe drinking water from their tap in their homes and schools here in California on an annual basis. Some families I know have gone literally generations now of not having safe water in their tap. The state has developed a whole program to really try and tackle this issue of access to safe drinking water. We call it SAFER, and it's really focused on investments in infrastructure, proactive solution development, technical assistance, implementation support, and we have some other state implementation tools as well that we're bringing in. We do a annual needs assessment, which just came out, and we will update annually. And that found that especially for these state small systems, which are under 15 connections, so very, very small communities that are below our regulatory threshold, and domestic wells, that the top contaminants statewide are nitrate, arsenic, 1,2,3-TCP, hexavalent chromium, and a couple others. But nitrate is estimated to be the most expensive to address on average, using any of the kind of cost measures that we looked at. So dairies are clearly a contributor of nitrate to groundwater locally, from dairy manure management and disposal, application of manure to cropland. There's certainly big differences and variations as to what local impacts are from individual dairies. But there is, I think, a really great study that I think some of the participants I see were helping to lead in the Central Valley. It's called the Dairy Representative Monitoring Program. It was conducted and funded by a group of regulated dairies in the Central Valley, and they did extensive monitoring and study over many years. They found elevated nitrate, nitrogen concentrations beneath all monitored dairies, and really impacts vary significantly, both from different parts of the dairy and by different management practices. There's a ton of recommendations that came out of that about how to improve practices and protect against really significant localized impacts. And a major focus is around improvement of practices on crop application of manure and dairy waste, and how to ensure that cropland is not a waste disposal mechanism that results that could otherwise result in really significant seepage to groundwater, and and that's a big area of focus. The Central Valley Regional Board adopted a regulatory program that was focused on protecting groundwater in particular, well over 10, maybe going on 15 years ago. And that at that time imposed really significant requirements on dairies, significantly new requirements at that time, and continued monitoring, this representative monitoring program that was conducted not to also be, as this went into effect, evaluating and informing whether the practices are actually protective. There are, I think, since 2012, the representative monitoring program had something like over 440 monitoring wells, over 250 well sites across different dairies, and so it was, I think, a great way of continuing to learn and dig into the particular impacts of dairies in the Central Valley. So based on those results and other evaluations, what we're seeing is that to date, implementation of the dairy order in the Central Valley hasn't resulted in a trend of lower nitrate concentrations across the industry in the Central Valley. And there is a recognition that improvements to the regulatory program are needed. Certainly, that doesn't mean that there haven't been drastic improvements with individual dairies or from particular implementation measures, but just looking more broadly about how are we changing the curve of nitrate concentrations. There's a recognition that we need to continue to improve the regulatory program. Right now, the State Water Board's considering a petition that was brought around, that I think there's the expectation there'll be some kind of precedential order out of the board, hopefully this year, maybe into next. I'm recusing myself from that process, but the Central Valley Board has also been working kind of on and off on updating the requirements of that of their regulatory program for years now, and I think are at this point looking to see what comes out of the state. Last thing just to mention is just a lot of what's being done right now. There's a really extremely important and significant salt and nutrient management program underway in the Central Valley called CV Salts. It requires all nitrate or nitrogen dischargers, including dairies, to participate in identifying and providing solutions for nitrate impacts to local drinking water supplies. And so this program's being phased in already, but already we, there's different priority regions, but for the first priority areas, the regional board sent out notices to comply to 650 dairies and about 170 calf and heifer ranches and beef feedlots in priority 1 areas to get participation in that program. I know there's been a lot of engagement from dairies and leadership in those areas, and they have recently submitted an early action plans that lay out how to identify and provide, or how they are going to identify and provide immediate solutions to local communities and households impacted by nitrate. And those were submitted, conditionally accepted for all except of these priority 1 areas, except for one, which was not accepted and sent for direction to cure. And those are actually implementing now. So they just last week, I guess, starting this week was really the sort of pressing the gas pedal. We're looking to see what that results in, but I think is a hugely important component of how the Valley is looking at addressing kind of the immediate term drinking water impacts. There were also an important additional component of that program, though, is looking at regional long-term nitrate management and reversing the curve of worsening nitrate contamination problems in the Valley. So that gives you some sense of kind of really localized water quality impacts. Happy to talk more always about this at a later time.
That's great. Thank you, Laurel. And I think just, to summarize, there is a lot of Californians that lack access to clean drinking water, both from a quantity standpoint as well as quality. There are lots of different types of contaminants, but one of the major ones is nitrate. There are lots of different sources of the nitrate, but dairies is one of the major sources. There's a lot of work that's been done to understand exactly what's going on dairies, where are the sources coming from dairies. A study that Laurel mentioned that's out there that talks about both the findings as well as potential solutions. And I would just say one of the major findings was that the vast majority, I think 93% of nitrate that ends up in groundwater from dairies comes from manure and manure application to cropland. So as we start getting into kind of solutions, definitely looking at dairies are applying manure to grow crops, and how do you do that and apply those nutrients in order to match up what the crops need is an ongoing challenge. And then there's a lot going on both in terms of industry looking at potential solutions as well as on the regulatory side, including a new kind of regulatory regime that is having dischargers, so dairies and other irrigated ag and other dischargers of nitrate come together to both figure out long-term solutions for that nitrate leaching as well as providing immediate drinking water for those impacted communities. So a lot still to do, but a lot going on and a lot of activity, I think, over the next 5-10 years in this area. And with that, I wanted to move, Frank, I think maybe we can talk a little bit about the air quality when we talk about trade-offs, but I wanted to move over to hear from Erin and Diana, just, based on all of this that you've heard. Obviously, you're managing this on a day-to-day basis, so wanted to hear from you about what are the types of things that you're doing on your dairy to address some of these environmental impacts, and maybe start with Diana.
Sure. Well, as we heard, I mean, there's so many complicated issues here to deal with, and it's challenging each day to kind of figure out which one of those you're going to tackle first. And for us, we also think, hey, we continue to learn and we continue to look for ways to improve and to enhance our conservation practices. And that's one of the things we're like just constantly learning and talking to others about, ways that we can all help each other in this area. And there are a number of practices that we've been doing over the years that I think help to deal with some of these issues. We've been no-till drill planting for years. I think one of the things too, in terms of our vertically integrated business, we look a lot at the byproducts and how we can utilize those byproducts that would otherwise be discarded. And one example of that in our cheesemaking business is the whey that is a byproduct of the cheesemaking process. It's mostly water, but it is rich in nutrients and minerals, and we use that to feed back to our cows as part of their diet. We're mixing that with silage that we grow on our property, as well as a number of other byproducts from other commodities to mix together and feed to the cows, such as almond hulls and brewer's grain and cottonseed, and again, things that really would otherwise not be used. But I did want to maybe focus a little bit of our impacts on two things that I think are maybe a little bit more unique to our farm, at least as compared to Erin's. And Frank talked about the methane digester. It's one of the things that we installed a little over a decade ago to help us to really capture and reduce the greenhouse gas emissions that were coming off of the cows. And I know Frank talked about it a little bit, but kind of thought I could kind of go through what our process is here and how we're doing that and how we're utilizing it and some of the other benefits that we see from having the digester on our property. So as I mentioned, it's we installed it in 2009, and what it is we're collecting that wastewater and manure from the cows through a gravity flow flush system using recycled water. The waste then runs through a machine that separates the solids from the liquids. The solid waste is then composted, which we primarily use for bedding for the cows. The liquid manure, which still has a fair amount of nutritional and fibrous material, is collected in a covered lagoon under a balloon-like tarp that is capturing that methane gas and transforming it by bacteria through the anaerobic digestion process and turning it into methane gas. The final product of that is a nearly clean natural gas. It's not revenue grade, but it does allow us to use that to operate a combustion engine to produce energy, which powers a portion of our dairy and creamery needs. At this point, it's about 50%, I think. I mean, when we first put it in, it was probably closer to 65%, but we've continued to expand on our creamery operation, thus adding to the electricity here on the farm. And we do have a carbon farm plan that was developed a few years ago. And through that, they were able to actually do a measurement of the reduction that we were experiencing in the greenhouse gas emissions compared to if we had not put in the digester and just had a traditional open manure lagoon scenario. It was about 50% at that point. So there's some other benefits too that we do experience from having the digester. I mentioned the recycled water that's used in the gravity flow flush system that comes from an overflow pond from our digester pond, and then we pump that back into a flush pond, and it's reused in the flush system to flush the system back into the digester, as well as to irrigate the silage fields where we're growing ryegrass that we then feed back to the cows. So there's a whole kind of cycle of byproducts there. We also are able to use heat from the combustion engine. We capture that through heat exchange plates to provide hot water for sanitation purposes in the dairy and the creamery, as well as heat up the milk for cheese making. So we're able to reduce our propane charges by having that process set up. And just want to mention too, this may get a little bit more technical, and certainly Frank could probably expand on this, but you know, after the bacteria has broken down the liquid during the anaerobic digestion process, the liquid is in a plant-ready stage, and then it travels from the digester pond to an overflow storage pond, and that's what's used to fertilize our fields where we're growing the silage back to the cows. That's kind of the digester process that we have in place, and you know, it's been in place now for over 12 years, so we kind of always are looking at ways to improve that. We have had to replace the engine and the generator a couple of years ago to keep that running at the optimal level. The latest thing and practice that we've put into place starting in the end of 2019 is a robotic milking machine. We replaced our old triangular milking parlor and installed 8 milking machines to milk the 430 cows that we've got right now. And there were a number of reasons that we did that. One being, you know, labor. Certainly that has helped to reduce the need for someone to be milking the cows 24/7. With the process too, there are some other benefits as well, with better udder health, with the cleaning system that the robots have in place, and increased cow comfort. I mean, one of the main things there that we kind of look at is we've taken the control of the milking process from humans, from us, and kind of put it into the hands of the cows, where they have the ability to determine and when they're going to get milked, rather than us saying, hey, you're going to get milked twice a day and here's the times you're going to get milked. And it's just amazing to see how that has created more of a calm environment with the cows. They're milking themselves more. So we're actually able to we could reduce our herd and still have more milk production. And I think, again, back to, I think, Frank's point of then really kind of taking some of that methane that would have otherwise been absorbed into the atmosphere, and we're kind of reducing that, but still being able to produce more milk that's going into the cheese that we produce. So those are just kind of some of the practices that we've put in place to try to combat that. I mean, there's a number of other things on healthy soils and making changes. And like I said, we're constantly looking at ways to improve and what we can do. And I love hearing about what other farmers are doing. I know certainly with the burping, that's become a big thing, and hearing about the use possibly of seaweed in their diet and how that could maybe affect it. But there's some really exciting things going on out there that I think can continue to help the industry.
Great, thank you, Diana. And I do know many of the practices you have, and you have a lot more than that. We don't have the time to go through all the practices, so appreciate you covering a few. And Aaron, wondering if you could also touch on a few of the practices you've been implementing as well.
Yeah, so like Diana said, running a dairy, there's many facets of it. It's a great business to be in if you never want to be bored. If you have curiosity, I mean, some days I am HR person, business owner, agronomist, cow care specialist, nutritionist for cows. So it's an industry that I love. So about 10 years ago, we looked at our dairy, looked at our farming operations. We're very fortunate that we're able to farm about 1,000 acres worth of row crop land within about 4 miles of our main dairy operations. We're able to grow the majority of our feed, 100% of our corn silage, winter silage, and all of our hays we can grow ourselves. So we looked at how can we have the biggest impact on our air and water. So we spent an intensive year looking at all aspects of the dairy, our farming operations. And I think you'll find with most dairy farmers, we're very focused on the cows. That's our main business. That's something we've gotten really good at in our operation over the last 80 plus years. And sometimes the growing of crops could be kind of an afterthought. So having the dairy side dialed in, we decided we need to become really good farmers. And that's going to give us the biggest bang for the buck on improving air quality and water quality. So one of the things in conjunction with sustainable conservation, they were great help in collaborating into our journey of conservation tillage. So what conservation tillage means, we're reducing the number of passes we go over our fields. We're minimizing the amount of tillage we're doing on our ground. For example, right now, this week, we are planting our corn. So instead of tilling up all of our fields, making 4 to 5 passes until we plant that seed of corn in the ground, we use a practice which is called strip tillage, where we only till up a 12-inch strip every 30 inches. So we're only tilling 40% of the overall surface area of our ground. So that reduces dust. If you come by while we're doing tilling or planting, you'll see zero dust behind the tractor, which makes my allergies very happy. Which has been great, but it has allowed us not only to reduce fuel consumption, it's had a huge financial impact on reducing our costs just in the amount of equipment we have. And our yields have gone up, and it's also helped increase our organic matter in our soils over the last 7 years. So we've seen some really cool changes in nitrogen holding capacity, which is a big area where it can have a huge impact on water quality. When we're applying and irrigating our nutrient water or applying our solid compost to our crops, we do it in an agronomic manner. We know that with the nitrogen holding capacity of our soils, we're keeping that nitrogen we apply in the root zone of the plant. Another thing we do is take advantage of the great climate in California. Unlike the Midwest, where you get 1 crop a year, maybe 1.5 crops a year, we can get 3 crops a year. So we can utilize every square inch of ground we have to make it productive and as efficient as possible in uptaking nutrients. So after our corn crop comes off, similar to what Diana is doing, we have a no-till drill, which is basically a big 30-foot wide piece of equipment that every 7.5 inches makes a little slice into the ground and drops our Sudan grass or our winter wheat seeds in the ground, and it grows. Instead of taking a week of doing tillage, turn around to plant the next crop, as soon as the corn chopper harvesting equipment leaves the field, we can be in with a tractor planting our next crop that we use for feeding our cows. So the big advantage of that, we're always keeping biomass active, and all of the beneficial microorganisms and fungi that are in our soil that help with root growth, it's always growing. So the difference, you have to be patient when you're making these type of management changes, especially when it comes to farming. But when you take a step back and look at a 30,000 foot view of where we were 10 years ago to today, it's really big changes, and it's really exciting. One of the other things we've done is we placed a big focus on water efficiency with the last drought. So unfortunately, it looks like we're going to another drought. And you know, when we look at our land, air, and water, those are all precious resources, and we want to be the best stewards as possible with them. So in our fields during our cropping year, we have a 48-inch moisture probe, and every 4 inches, it measures the amount of water in that soil profile. So one of the things we do to conserve water is we will match the amount of water we apply to the ground only to where the root system of the crop we're growing is at. So with some of our systems, we've had a 40% savings in water versus previous practices. Not only does that conserve water, but then the nutrient water we apply, or where we don't have access to nutrient water, it keeps those fertilizers right within the root zone of that crop. And I think it's important to remember, as dairy farmers, it is a very thin margin business. It is a commodity business. So all of us watch every penny. We don't want to overspend on fertilizer or over apply on anything if we can help it, because it has a detrimental financial impact to our business and sustainability of that business. And so if we can use technology like that, where we know we are using every ounce of fertilizer we can, and it's going to that crop that then goes to feed our cows, it's in our best interest. And going forward, it's had a huge impact on our business and the longevity of it here in California. One of the other things, the impacts we saw we could do is how we handle our manure. So in 2014, we invested in some sophisticated manure solid removal equipment. And we are removing almost all of our solids. We have a centrifuge that we just installed a couple months ago. And basically all of our water, after we've had all the fiber and most of the solids left over, it kind of looks like light coffee or dark tea. And through the centrifuge that's traveling at 2,200 RPMs, it then pushes out all the rest of the solids. So we're able to deal with our manure in a solid form, which we compost to use on our own cropping operations, and we can also sell it to other agricultural producers within the valley. So it's try to make what we have as value added as possible as we can. So for us, and just our philosophy, like Diana said, you know, we're always learning. We try to install culture on our dairy and in our farming operations of, you know, culture of continuous improvement. And one of the things when we're interviewing people and hiring people, the number one thing I look for is curiosity and a willingness to learn. So I think that's one of the big things we've seen on our operation. We've seen other dairy farmers and crop farmers do in the valley throughout the state is just be a continuous learner. Change isn't going to happen overnight, but if you make small changes over the long run, those add up to a big positive impact.
Thank you both. And I see between the two of you, you've talked about a lot of different great practices and technologies, from digesters to using byproducts, recycled water, compost, conservation tillage, water efficiency in ag. I think maybe just one thing to call out in case it isn't clear to the audience. One of the very interesting things about dairies, and one of the complicated things about dairies, is they use the manure that the cows generate to provide nutrients for the feed crops or for the forage, which means that they aren't using synthetic fertilizer or using less synthetic fertilizer, which has a whole host of benefits. But manure is a really complicated thing to figure out. There's different types of nitrogen in it. It's hard to figure out what's plant available, how much is in there. So it is very tricky to manage, and even academics that are studying it are still trying to figure it out. So, the benefit of using that kind of naturally available fertilizer as opposed to synthetic, but then also some of the challenges that come with that. And with that, I know I want to make sure we give some time for questions from the audience, but I did want to touch briefly, because it's really important to think about, not just each individual kind of environmental emissions, but looking at all of them together. And many of the things we're talking about as it relates to dairies are about manure management. And so Dr. Mitloehner, I'm wondering if you could just talk briefly about why it's ill-advised to only focus on carbon or greenhouse gas or any single emission, and kind of some of the trade-offs. And maybe you can touch on air quality as well, since we haven't really talked about that yet.
Yeah, well, these trade-offs certainly exist. So I think it's ill-advised to focus on one gas, such as ammonia only or methane only or so, because there are these trade-offs. For example, that most recent regulation, or not regulation, but legislation, SB 1383, led to certain practices that were recommended. For example, conversion of flush to scrape barns as one way to reduce methane. And it's true that, probably overall you do reduce methane, but we did some research, for example, in what this would do if we were to convert flush barns. Flush barns, for those of you who don't know that, that means cow barns, barns, freestall barns where cows are housed. Instead of removing the manure with water, that's called a flush, removing it with scrape, scraping it out, and then not storing it in a lagoon, but storing it as a solid. So one of the proposed measures to reducing methane was that conversion of flush to scrape. So we did research into what that would entail. And what we found was, yes, some methane reductions might occur, but in the barns, we would find 4 times more ammonia going off. Why? Because when you scrape, then you kind of generate a thin film of manure, and every time urine hits that manure film, then ammonia goes off. And the flushing just does a much greater job in removing everything, the urine and feces at the same time. So a classical unintended consequence of changing from the one to the other to reduce, let's say, methane would lead to maybe more emissions of ammonia. And we don't want to have that trade-off. We don't want to trade climate wins with air quality losses. That's just one example. There's another example I have, which is we have looked into almost 100 feed additives, of which 95 didn't work. 5 did work and generated reductions anywhere between 10 to 50% of methane. So that's great. But one of them, pretty much the one that's discussed most often, which works really well in reducing methane from enteric sources, meaning from belching, makes it all the way into the manure. And once that manure is land applied as fertilizer, that manure then generates more nitrous oxide. And nitrous oxide is even more potent than methane. So again, a trade-off that we don't want to see. We don't want to reduce methane from belching and then have more greenhouse gas net impact from the manure. So it is really important that we conduct research that looks into the whole life cycle of emissions, not just carbon, but also nitrogen and others. We do not want to reduce, let's say, atmospheric losses, atmospheric emissions. We don't want to reduce atmospheric pollutants and trade them with water pollutants. So for example, have less ammonia and then more nitrate leaching into the groundwater. It is really important for people to understand that the complexities around these nutrient transformations are really great. And it takes time to study them, and it takes also support, financial support to do that. And I'm hoping for more public support to do this kind of research, because whenever private support kicks in and let's say companies or organizations like the dairy industry support research, then certain people pipe up and say, well, this research cannot be trusted because of who funded it. but oftentimes, most often times, mitigation research is not funded from public sources, and that's a problem. We need to change that.
And Laurel, I'll just go to you. Maybe this is an unfair question to ask you to answer in like 1 minute, but if we could, so we can get to the audience Q&A, I think, you know, Frank talked about the trade-offs from just a science standpoint and thinking about, you know, what might you implement on farm, but that also poses a challenge for government agencies that have specific mandates to regulate a specific emission. So I'm wondering if you could just speak briefly to that issue and what the state's doing about that.
Yeah, so we as State Water Board or Regional Water Board have very specific mission and scope of what we regulate and protect, and that's just about water. But we are very aware of the need, like you said, to look across media, across agencies, to figure out how we can collectively enable and facilitate really important strategies across media and agencies. So the Healthy Soil Initiative is definitely the best example, I would say, of this within the dairy space. You know, we want dairies to compost their manure, to, you know, have that be yet another byproduct that can get off their farms to more beneficial reuse as crops, as the crops to which manure can be applied are limited, whereas compost is broader because it kills pathogens. So, and, you know, most importantly, really, it builds healthier soils, it builds water retention, reduces runoff and erosion. So we've got a initiative working with CDFA, CalRecycle, local air districts, and us to develop a calculator tool to help farmers calculate how much can be composted on site before they would need to obtain permits from various agencies. And we, just as an example, a lot of this is figuring out where are there barriers, what can help facilitate the kinds of practices we all want to see, and that we amended our just last year our composting general order to kind of clarify that and allow for dairy operators to be able to move manure off their dairies to go to a farm that's composting, for example. So it's not easy, it is really hard, but I think Healthy Soils Initiative is a good example of ways we're trying to approach that.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to fold in, I see one question in here that is kind of related to the next question I wanted to ask Aaron and Diana, well, I assume which would be part of your answer. So the question that I had was, this seems like a lot to deal with. You have other things you're trying to do on your dairy, not the least of which is take care of animals and produce milk, but a whole host of other things. So, and run a profitable business. So that's where I'll fold in there's a question about the economics and kind of what does the economics of dairying look like. So I'll kind of, if you could wrap that into your response to my question, which is, you know, what other things are you dealing with and how does that impact your ability to work on the environmental issues? Maybe start with Aaron.
Yeah, so there's a lot to deal with on a daily basis, some more than others. One of the big things work on is this labor availability. Number of people going into animal agriculture has been on the decline. So on a daily basis, we've put a lot of focus on the culture of our business. We want to make sure that if anybody does want to work on a dairy or farming operation, that we are at the top of their list, and that the best salespeople for working on our farm is our current team. So with that and all the things we do, it comes back to people. You know, if we want to do all these great things and how we farm and, you know, take great care of the animals, it all comes back to people. So we put a lot of emphasis on that. And we've been very fortunate that focus on culture and the lives of our team members, that's come back to pay dividends of, you know, we have a really stable workforce. I mean, we've had people have been here close to 40 years, and the majority of our workforce has been here for 10 to 15 years plus. So The economics of that, California, I mean, like any commodity business, it can be up and down. We are affected everything from trade with China and appetite for corn and soybeans. We're also affected by the weather in Brazil. That can affect our feed prices here and profitability. So a big focus of my time is managing risk, financial risk when it comes to that. We have tools where we can hedge our feed prices and also put a floor on our milk prices. So coming up with those systems that allows us to not worry so much about the margins, as long as we consistently do those things and we can focus on our people, focus on taking great care of our animals, and then also being, good stewards of our land, water, and air. So there's a million other things that go on. Sometimes it feels like you're juggling, 200 objects in the air at one time, but it's something that I still love.
How about you, Diana?
Can I just say ditto? Yeah, similar things that we deal with. My number one thing was also labor. Certainly right now there seems to be a shortage of labor. We have between our cheese operation and our dairy, right now I think we're at about 85 employees. So it's a lot to make sure we're being competitive and managing that and trying to entice new people to come into the industry. Certainly, as Aaron mentioned, ag isn't an industry that people are necessarily clamoring to come into. One of the things for us too is more so maybe than the Valley is just the high cost of living. And so as a result, as I mentioned, we've got 10 residents here on the farm, which we reserve for our dairy employees. And so that's just a whole nother business and thing that we're having to manage and deal with. But even though we try to look at ways we can automate things to help out and use technology, there's a balance. We don't, we still have a great need for employees and people, and trying to cultivate that culture, as Aaron said, is something we work on daily, really. Other things that we deal with, well, one thing that isn't really quite here, but it kind of lends itself to it because we also look at other alternative energy sources. As I mentioned, the methane digester is great. It doesn't cover all of our electricity needs. So, we've contemplated other things in terms of solar here on the farm and haven't been able to quite make that work yet. But in our cheese plant in Petaluma, it's heavy equipment in the creamery where we're pasteurizing milk, we're receiving milk, processing all of that, making cheese, we're age facilities, so we've got a lot of refrigeration needs. So our electricity costs there are quite high. So we did actually, were able through managing a refinance of our debt, able to use some of those funds to install solar panels in our Petaluma cheese plant. That is just about ready, fingers crossed, to get turned on. So we'll start to see some of the benefit of that. But our early estimates are it will hopefully cover over 50% of our electricity charges there. And we'd like to be able to try to do something here on the farm as well. So that's going to be our next step is, how we can incorporate that to supplement the digester. And then lastly, I'd say, and I think this is probably something all dairy farmers and anyone that's making a product that is coming from a dairy product, such as for us cheese, that traditional dairy, as we've all mentioned, is often vilified as the #1 contributor to global warming, and it becomes such a big topic that our branding is really trying, marketing is really trying to kind of challenge that or fight that every day. And we're very, active on social media, and we have a robust consumer base who, loves our cheese, but they, I think, have that curiosity too, to really know and understand. But again, back to that education piece, that's something that, we are really trying to get out that message to people about things that are happening that can kind of help to combat some of the issues as far as, really everyone trying to go to plant-based and alternative dairy products. So, that's a constant challenge for us to deal with on a daily basis.
Thank you. And I want to start moving to questions from the audience here. And Dr. Mitloehner, thank you. You are actively answering a lot of them. So I will prioritize some of the open ones. Aaron, a question for you about what do you do with the liquid from that centrifuge process?
So with the liquid the liquid portion that comes off that centrifuge process, we've taken out most of the nutrients. We still have some nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and we agronomically apply that with our irrigation water during our cropping seasons. So we have extensive testing program where we're regularly testing our solid manure and also our liquid nutrients are left after that solid removal process. And then we have calculators based on the stage of growth that the plant is on, what those nutrient requirements are, and try to match those up as closely as possible. It's not perfect science, but we get pretty close to matching what it needs. Because I mean, there's various forms of nitrogen. It's not all available for the plants right away. So, we have to figure, during that process that it's mineralized and ready for plant, and kind of, you're always thinking about 3 or 4 steps ahead. So we're very fortunate, the land around our main dairy, we use 0 synthetic fertilizers. Our other farms were in a nitrogen deficit. So that's why I place a big emphasis on solids removal. So we can take from where we have the nitrogen, move it to those nitrogen deficit farms. And we're essentially our own fertilizer producers. That hedges us on price risk of like what we're seeing right now, where nitrogen has gone up 40% just with global shortages. And we also get that benefit of adding more organic matter through our compost to our soils, and just creating an overall healthier soil and land, which, as a result, produces great crops that we get to use to feed our cows to produce milk.
Great, thank you, Aaron. I see a question in here, and Frank, I know you're busy typing in, or Dr. Mitloehner typing in answers, but either maybe the dairy producers or Dr. Mitloehner, there's a question about AMP, so kind of non-digester alternatives to reducing methane and the role that they can play both in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and improving water quality. And I love that question, because I'll just say that's something that we've been looking a lot at. We see a lot of opportunity there for kind of addressing both the greenhouse gas as well as the water quality and the nitrate leaching challenges. So I'll just throw that out to if anyone feels like they want to answer that about the role of AMP as a solution.
Well, maybe I give it a stab. I did research for the state on evaluating some of those technologies, some of those AMP technologies that can be used on dairies of all size, from small to large. What they normally do is they help us get the so-called volatile solids out of the waste stream. And those are the compounds that could become and will become methane. And so these could be things such as separators. There are different types of separators. Some of them are mechanical separators. Some of them are things called weeping walls. And some of them are quite remarkable in their solid removal ability. Okay, and I don't want to be too technical, but what that means is when you remove those volatile solids from the liquid stream, then they cannot convert into methane and release that gas. And so some of those M technologies have a really good potential effect and actual effect. What we also have seen is that it's really important that these M technologies are not just designed, but also built and maintained according to protocol. Okay, and this is really important because sometimes people run shortcuts. They build a technology, but they don't build it according to design and engineering specs, and then they don't work. it's really important when you deploy an AMP technology that it is built and operated in the way it was intended. And then some of these technologies can be very effective. So to me, it's really good to know that there are scalable solutions from small to large that are effective if applied correctly.
Yeah, so for us, the AMP program has been great. We're actually doing one of the demonstration projects in collaboration with a team from UC Davis right now on pelletizing our compost to make it easier to store and then also easier to apply and transport as well by densing up that product and reducing the overall mass of it. It's been having a program like that, if we were to do it by ourselves, the trial and error of figuring things out could be very costly, but be able to collaborate has been great, and having, be able to bring in technical knowledge that we don't have within our business, and it's not my purview, has been really beneficial. So we're excited about some of the results we're seeing, and that, we can share with the rest of the dairy industry.
And I'll just add for clarification there that the link here is that a lot of these AMP practices, as Dr. Mitloehner mentioned, you're getting a lot of the manure out of the liquid form and into solid form. That also makes it easier to convert that manure into different types of products. And one of the challenges, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, is there are dairies that have too much manure, and if they were to convert it into different products and put it, kind of sell those off-site, then that would help address the nitrate issue. The great opportunity there is we have millions of acres of irrigated land that needs nutrients, that needs, that this manure products could help build up the soils, the degraded soils. And so there's a big opportunity to both help address the greenhouse gas issues, the water quality, kind of leaching issues, as well as build soil health and more broadly in the region. So Diane, I saw you take yourself off mute. Did you want to add something about that?
I was just going to say, I think that, programs like the AMP program are vital to doing a lot of these practices. As Aaron mentioned, just the expertise you can get, but the funding, so we, also when we looked at installing our digester, that was one of the big challenges, is how to fund it. It's a very expensive proposition. And we were fortunate that there was some grant money available that helped us pay for, I think it was like 65% of installing that. And I think to continue these programs is really important. And I think last year they cut the funding, and then, I think it's hopefully increased in the budget now for the future, but it's really vital. And a lot of these organizations that are able to provide both the expertise and grant funding, we've got a number of local agencies here that we work with, and that's really critical, I think, to helping farmers figure out how to do some of these things.
And then I'm hoping that the audience can see the great answers that Frank has been putting in. We'll also follow up, I believe, with, we can include those in the follow-up, those answers. I'll try to take two quick responses and see if anyone has any additions to make. One of them is about which dairies are composting or vermicomposting on site. I don't know that I can answer that, but there are dairies that are composting. It depends on different parts of the state to the extent to which they are doing that. To the point about trade-offs, one of the challenges with composting in the San Joaquin Valley is open windrow composting does produce VOC and ammonia gas emissions, which is a challenge in the San Joaquin Valley because it's a severe non-attainment zone. So that is a challenge that some of the agencies and others are working on, as well as ourselves. And then vermicomposting, I would say, is less common, but it is increasing. And the other question is related to the consumption of water in the dairy industry and water availability versus where dairies are. I think the easy version of that is, as I mentioned before, a lot of the dairies are in the San Joaquin Valley, which is not where a lot of the precipitation falls. We have a whole nother session on water availability and groundwater and access to water. But as we heard before, a lot of dairies are doing a lot of recycling of the water that they're using on site. And there's a lot of emerging technologies. Aaron talked about some of the center pivot irrigation work that he's doing to be more efficient with water use. We helped develop a drip irrigation system that uses that liquid manure instead of synthetic fertilizer. So there's a lot of innovation going on to help dairies address their water consumption. And so I'll just a quick pause to see if any of you wanted to add anything before we wrap up on those questions about composting or water. Okay. So my final question, getting back to the title of the webinar today, which is a difficult question to answer. We knew when we put it out there, but just wanted to ask. So from your perspective, can dairies be environmentally sustainable? And then I'll just ask Aaron and Diana really quickly also to add on the other question I wanted to ask, which is, this is all really complicated. Why are you still dairying? So if each of you could answer, can dairies be environmentally sustainable? And then our dairy producers give a quick response on why they're continue to dairy. Maybe start with, I'll go in alphabetical order again, starting with you, Aaron, and we've got like a minute for each of these.
Sounds good.
30 seconds.
So to answer your first question, yes, but it definitely takes management. It takes hard work, but I believe it can be done in areas where there are shortfalls now. Some of the emerging technology that's available and different practices we can use. I think the answer to that is yes. And then why am I still in the dairy business? I don't know, there's several, times a month I wonder that myself, to be completely honest. It's not always the easiest business to be in. But when I feel like that, I kind of take a step back and I look, we're very fortunate. I get to work in a business that, fulfills all my curiosities. I get to go dig and count worms, for fun and see changes at work with great people. And it comes down to that. I look at the team I work with every day, and, that's what gets me up in the morning, seeing them and their families and the dedication they've had to working with our animals in our land, and also just being a business where, my 3 young kids can come to work for me. So all those things kind of play into it. Why continue to be in the dairy business? And, will there be a 5th generation that wants to be in it? It's completely up to them. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Thanks, Diana.
Yes, I would also agree with Aaron that the answer to, can dairies be environmentally sustainable? Yes, but you can't rest on your laurels. As we, mentioned, you've got to be constantly asking questions and looking at new ways to do things. And that involves, it takes a village, we can't do it all. You can't be the expert in everything. And so utilizing the resources that are available to us to help with these practices, and never being satisfied that you've done enough to do that. And as Aaron mentioned, it's a roller coaster. I mean, we didn't even talk about COVID and the pandemic and how our businesses have changed over the last year. I mean, that's a whole nother topic into itself. But certainly water, I didn't talk about that as much, but we have a very water challenged area, and this record drought that we're dealing with right now is certainly a #1 topic for us. First of all, the short term, how can we get through the issues and have enough resources, water resources, to operate our dairy and to operate our creamery. But how can we do things in the future too, to get to a point where we're less reliant on water, and things we can do when there are rainy seasons to kind of capture that for the next drought, because it's not going away. So it's definitely part of our future. But for us too, I think, again, being vertically integrated in the fact that we've got this successful cheese business that we rely on milk from cows, and then having that control, at least to some extent, on a good portion of the milk in our cheese. allows us to be adaptable and flexible and you know, figure out how we're going to do that. But it's important for us, I think, to remain in the dairy business while we're certainly in the cheese business. So they kind of go hand in hand. And you know, it's a legacy in our family that we hope to continue to the next generation. And have something to pass along to them, and then hopefully they can take it and steward, you know, the land and all of the challenging issues even better than we're doing today, and contributing to the local community. I mean, that's a whole other thing too. That, you know, it's a small community out here in West Marin, and we feel like we're a viable part of that community. We want to continue to be that. And there's a lot of other, you know, things that are out there that I think contribute to that. We've got a great local agricultural land trust here that's helping to keep agriculture viable in the county. It's the Marin Agricultural Land Trust, which provides great service for a lot of the farming families out here as well. So there's, I could go on and on. I know I've gone over my minute, but just wanted to emphasize that, you know, there's just different things and ways of looking at things every single day. It's a roller coaster, but we still love being in the business, and we'll continue to want to pass that on to the next generation.
Great, thank you. And we are over time, so I'll just ask maybe if Frank and Laurel, if you have burning addition to that, otherwise we can wrap up and get people off to the next probably Zoom meeting.
Well, let's wrap up. I could say more, but let's wrap up then. Okay.
Well, I just really want to thank all of you for your time here, providing your perspectives and input, and for everyone joining us. I learned a lot, as I always do. And thank you for the participants. We'll be following up with a link to the recording of this, and just wanted to let you know the next topic is around soil health, which actually came up several times in this discussion. So please stay tuned for that, and look forward to connecting again next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you.